Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were all meant to shine as children do. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others.
Hello and welcome to another video from History, Myth and Legend. The Earth's Moon. Introduction. In this video, I will attempt to make an introductory platform to a future playlist where I will expand some of the topics here presented, others that I believe to be relevant, and also those from my own making from my trilogy, The Helix Tree. So let's begin. Science, that once worked from uncertainty to probability, in a never-ending attempt to better its own answers, has in the last 200 years or so relabeled certain unproven probabilities into certainties and stuck to them, improving them but rejecting all others that might very well be wrong but do nonetheless deserve their chances to be proven right. Let me make it perfectly clear that when I mean right, I mean as the best explanation whatever problem is being analyzed at any given moment in time. Because of this faulty ideology, we now live in a uniformitarian, gradualistic, self-centered, over-zealous, materialistic and religiously dogmatic era of science that, although drowning humans with more and more redundant gadgets, has done little for a better explanation of reality, of space, of life and of energy than the very same answers we had nearly 2 centuries ago. We happen to live in a planet that has a very large moon, about 1/4 of the size of the Earth, making it the 5th largest moon orbiting the 5th largest planet. That makes it more like a binary system than the normally observed relationship between planets and their moons. Having a moon this size, these two bodies coexist in a continuous dance around the Sun, while he tugs the entire solar system in his journey around the galaxy. In their daily lives, present-day urbanistic humans understand little of the strong connection between the Earth and the Moon, beyond perhaps of the regular and predictable ocean tides, and that only for those that live in coastal countries. But it was not so in the distant past. In fact, our ancestors gave great reverence to the Moon and feared its powers, while asked for its help and blessings. To them, the Moon was either a god or a goddess. Considering its 28-day cycle, it was a much easier form of counting time than the long 365 years in a year, why many believe that it was the base for the first human calendar. Here I would add that due to the Moon's shape transformation, it provides a marker for the entire biome. No matter what culture one looks upon, the Moon was sacred, divine, and very much alive and watching. Some believe that during the new moon, she or he would come down to Earth, thus explaining his or hers absence from the sky. Many studies, like the ones I will mention here and that you will find in the description below, have tried to dismiss ancient and more recent beliefs on moon effects over humans, animals, and even plants and trees. All show biological changes during the various phases of the lunar cycle that, although statistically significant, are dismissed under the claim of these being very small and because it could be a coincidence, naturally occurring in cycles, therefore independent of the moon. But is it all there is between the moon and life here on Earth? Were the wisest of our ancestors so mistaken in taking these influences over the land and those living in it? Maybe not. For instance, we know that human and animal physiology are subject to seasonal lunar and circadian rhythms. Although the former and the latter have been often studied, the lunar cycle effects on the behavior and physiological conditioning has not. But science has documented changes in human fertility, in female menstruation that seems to be related with melatonin levels at birth rate. In insects, it affects hormonal changes early in phylogenesis. In fish, the lunar clock influences reproduction. In birds, the daily variations in melatonin and corticosteroid disappear during full moon days. Another example would be the effects on laboratory rats that experience taste sensitivity and the changes to the ultrastructure of pineal gland cells. It all points to melatonin, that is secreted principally by the pineal gland and mainly at nighttime. Please note that while science tries to explain this with light exposure or the absence of it, I stand to the possibility that these effects are being caused by electromagnetic radiation and/or the gravitational pull of the moon, and also its phase and intensity. Supporting it, I found a study from 2013 in which researchers measured the effects of changing lunar cycles on male university students' cardiovascular system. They found out that the blood pressure dropped by around 5 millimeters of mercury during new moon and full moon phases. This also included a step test, and it was found that their heart rate and blood pressure were both lower during full and new moons. Moreover, their heart rates after exercise also returned to normal levels quickly during full and new moons. The researchers' conclusion was that during full and new moons, humans had superior endurance and were physically more efficient and capable. This study was then contested by another that was performed in 2020, reporting no variations in blood pressure or heartbeat. Also from 2020, and studying people with type 2 diabetes, also presented no influence in blood pressure, however, found it did impact other related functions, including blood sugar levels and heart rate. So it's all for grabs. Either humans display different results in different situations and orbital positions against its fellow residents of this cosmic corner of the universe, or science is surfing two masters and thus opposite results often come forward. However, the exact mechanism of the moon's influence on humans and animals still awaits a rise in interest and investment in order for further exploration, so that knowledge of this kind of cyclical, biorhythmic causes and effects might be better understood. Unfortunately, until some corporative economical return is perceived, only few and often poorly founded studies will be performed, and most likely dismissed afterwards. So far, what cannot be denied is its curious effect upon a very interesting part of the brain, the pineal gland, of whose significance would make for a video of its own. This seems a good place to move on to the moon's energy grid. As I described in my video Places of Power, Places of Magic, there is at least one energy grid related with the moon. It's known as the Curie lines, discovered by Siegfried Wittmann in 1950. It was only published 2 years later by Manfred Curie that ended up giving the name to this grid as an homage for publishing Wittmann's work in 1952. According to Wittmann, the strength of this grid varies in relation to the moon's phase, making it stronger during the full moon and weakest at new moon. However, it seems to have a strong resonance where it crosses the Hartmann grid. The Curie grid can be of both positive or negative nature and effect, and might be dangerous where it crosses underground waterways. The energy of this current shifts 4 times each day as the Earth rotates. The moon has a moonrise, has its noon, moonset, and midnight. Many believe that their own energy also shifts at these times. The science. We are told that the moon is now moving away from the Earth at a rate of 3.78 centimeters per year, or about 1.5 inches. And for the moment, I accept that value. But to think it represents a constant during the many millennia that separates us from the past is but absurd and folly. If we take the moon's current drift and project back in time, we end up with a collision happening around 1.5 billion years ago. However, the gathered data tells us that the moon was formed around 4.5 billion years ago, meaning that the current recession rate is a poor guide for the past. Science uses the present drift rate to calculate how much closer the moon was in the distant past, saying in this paper from September 26, 2022, that 2.46 billion years ago, the moon was 37,280,000 miles, or 60,000 kilometers closer to the Earth, and that at this distance, the length of the day cycle would be reduced to 17 hours instead of the current 24. But I beg to differ, and I say they don't know, nor should claim to know how far it was then, at least until they can provide a better answer than a mathematical result from a deficient equation. I say this because although this looks like sound and clear science, It is based on assumptions born out of uniformitarianism, meaning it ignores all and every catastrophic event that might have happened. But what if the moon was closer? Much closer. Wouldn't this proximity change Earth's gravity? Would the moon counterbalance Earth's gravity pull and explain how the biome had grown to an otherwise unimaginable size? If so, could we replace or add to the many myths describing a smaller Earth by or with a closer moon? I wondered if I was alone in this concept, but I did find a scientific paper that explores this perspective, also in the links within the description. However, by having a much closer moon also leads into serious problems with ocean tides, earthquakes, and volcanism. But there is no way of knowing for sure how big were the oceans, or if there were oceans as we imagine them today. I believe life would still be possible in many places. But since all tales must have a beginning, let's start with the first question we must ask when considering the moon. How did we get the moon? There are many good answers to this question, although obviously, no matter who claims otherwise, we cannot know for sure, not until we become a much higher form of civilization and start seeing this type of cosmic birth ourselves. Even then, I believe we will find that most, if not all, the mechanisms so far presented have their value and may very well be possible, each one according to a specific set of circumstances. To say that there is only one way of explaining the origin of a moon, a planet, or a star is in the very least anti-scientific. Although there were once 4 hypotheses in the table, only one is currently accepted by the mainstream science. Moon origins. These are the 4 theories brought forward by the scientific community. The condensation theory, also known as co-accretion, was proposed in 1873 by Edouard Roche, a French astronomer and mathematician. In it, both Moon and the Earth come to be by condensing individually from the nebula that formed the solar system. But it also stated that the Moon formed already in orbit around the Earth. However, if the Moon was formed in the vicinity of the Earth, it would have nearly the same composition, and we today know it to be different. This was once largely believed by the academics to be the solution of this mystery. My personal opinion is that this theory do have its merits, especially as combined and midterm is found between it and the theory that follows it here. The fission theory. It was George Howard Darwin, none other than the son of the famous Charles Darwin, that proposed the fission theory. It was the year of 1878, and in it, George states that during the early days of the solar system, the Earth was spinning extremely fast and part of the planet was ripped apart to form the Moon. Shortly after, Osmond Fisher, a British geologist, and one of the first to propose the idea that the Earth consisted of a solid crust floating above a fluid core, theorized that the area where the Moon had formed originated from the outer layers of what today is the Pacific Ocean basin. These ideas were widely accepted for a while and helped to explain why the density of the Moon is similar to the outer layers of the Earth. Presently, this theory has lost favoritism and is no longer supported by the scientific community. This because during the 1900s, many scientists came forward saying that while it is true that the Earth spun faster during its formation, the calculated speed needed for the Earth to spin so fast that a portion of the planet would become detached was, and is still, incompatible with the numbers needed for achieving angular momentum separation. It was finally abandoned when scientists were able to study the rocks brought back by Apollo missions, and found that even though both the Moon and Earth share many similar minerals, the lunar rocks are chemically different to those on Earth's surface. The capture theory. In 1909, an American astronomer named Thomas Jefferson Jackson explained his capture theory, according to which the Moon had formed elsewhere in the solar system to the likeness of asteroids, but ended up captured by the gravitational force of the Earth when it flew too close to the planet. The Moon was then trapped and now orbits the Earth. To me, this theory is plausible for cases where the size of the captured satellite is smaller than in the case of the Moon. From my perspective, at this scale, This would imply that the Earth would also suffer serious changes in its orbit around the Sun, while the two bodies struggle for equilibrium. This would bring catastrophic events in climate and would most certainly kill all life, if any, at that time. This theory does help explaining why the composition of the Moon and the Earth are different. As a final point, this is considered the most unlikely among the four main theories. The giant impact hypothesis. Although the Apollo mission was originally intended to test existing theories, as this failed before the new data, it inspired the development of a new one. We are now within the 1970s, the initial years of this new idea. It tells of an impact with Earth right at the end of its formation with another planet-sized body, probably as big as planet Mars. This obviously was so powerful a blow that sent a great deal of debris into Earth's orbit, which in turn is believed to have coalesced into the Moon we see today. The imagining wandering planet would receive the name Theia, after the Greek goddess who gave birth to the Moon. This theory came with the apparent power to reconcile multiple lines of evidence, by being a mixture of Earth's and Theia's outer layers. Rather than from their cores, it explains why the Moon is iron poor. Moreover, the required offset impact would also provide further evidence towards the Earth's rapid initial spin, and explains why the Moon is lacking in volatile materials that would become vaporized during impact. Funny enough, this theory was initially received with skepticism and met strong resistance while being considered as a contrived solution requiring an extremely unlikely event. Personally, and although this is the now accepted canon for the Moon's formation, it is for me the one I will place last in the scale of possibilities exposed here. Since I am presenting the recognized theories for the birth of the Moon, I will, for the sake of impartiality, also make reference to one researcher that, although not yet widely known, I think has its merits and should be given attention by the scientific community. I speak of J. Bouguier, M.A., a philosopher of science and religion, whose solution for this problem seems to unite all the so far gathered evidences while combining aspects of the most relevant theories described above. Since I could never give justice to his ideas, I will limit myself to provide a link to his work that you can find at the top right of the screen now and within the description in this video. The Moon in the helix tree. Now that we looked into how it was formed from a scientific point of view, I will now end with a small dive into my own imaginarium. But before I do, allow me to point out that the Earth without the Moon was a wobbly planet with a fast rotation and unforgiving climate, where life could not develop but merely exist, while Mars was a planet with a biodiversity only slightly inferior to the Earth when both were at their prime. Mars was a planet with vast inland seas and forest-covered landscapes, harboring a pristine environment. This said, and according to my own developed mythology, the Moon's existence in our solar system is as much accidental as its current position is purposeful and deliberate. Playing a relevant part in my trilogy, the Moon is a very complex object, what I would call as an Aryan-forming ship, unwillingly transforming to an ark and having its own stargate within. A rushed cosmic raft for galactic refugees, desperately fleeing from the consequences of their own deeds. After a long story that I will not utter here, the Moon's arrival at our solar system was the cause of many things to come, from the destruction of Phaeton, now the asteroid belt, to the demise of Mars, the then largest harbor of life in the solar system and home base to the native shepherds of our galaxy for this star system, to the second and ultimate sin committed by the fallen against the rules of the path, this being the creation of mankind. Thank you all for watching. My name is Ricardo Calvario, and you can find me through the links in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe and comment. I would love to see what you all think. On a last note, I noticed that only 20% of my regular viewers have subscribed to this channel. If you are one of them, please consider subscribing. It helps me in more than one way. Thank you all, and until our next meeting.
I regret to announce this is the end. I'm going now. Bid you all a very fond farewell.